Welcome to the Small Town Podcast. My name is Sarah Roach Lewis, and I'm really excited to be here today talking to both Mark Sandiford and Rob Oakie. Before we jump in, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about both of them. Mark is the Executive Director for CreativePEI, which is the sector council for the creative industries on PEI. He has served on lots of boards over the years and is currently Chair of Art in the Open, Vice Chair of FilmPEI, Secretary of VideogamesPEI, and member at large at Discover Charlottetown. Mark is a documentary filmmaker by trade and worked for many years as a producer with CBC TV, mostly in the North. Mark's film, can you say that name, please?
Hello, Nat.
Thank you. Why White People Are Funny won a special Gemini Award for the best reflection of Canada's racial and cultural diversity in 2008. It is consistently one of the highest viewed films on the NFB's website and was ranked among their top 10 films of the 2000s. And then we have Rob, who is the Executive Director and co-founder of Music PEI. Since 2008, the organization has assisted in increasing the number of internationally touring artists by 500%. That is amazing. Music PEI is passionate about creating effective policies and protecting individual rights. The music industry has an unfortunate past of not respecting equal rights and a poor record of gender equality. So these are some of the many things that the organization is now working to change on. So thank you both for being here. And we're going to spend a little bit of time today just talking about, such riveting topics as policy in organization. So I'd love to just hear, Mark, if you can get us started, just in terms of, the reality is policy is one of those things that we tend to think makes our eyes cross. It's kind of boring. But tell me from your perspective as an executive director, what is the value and what is the importance of having good, strong policies within your organization?
Well, I came into this whole executive director thing with a filmmaking background. I had no idea how governance works, policies, any of that kind of stuff. And so I got on a bunch of boards, and over the years, I've kind of discovered where boards struggle and where boards run smoothly. And one of the key things that I've discovered is that policies are it. They're kind of the key. Like after you got a good set of bylaws and you know what you're doing, then you need to set up some consistent policies so that you don't have to kind of start from scratch every time a question comes up. Every time somebody says they're in a conflict of interest position, or sometimes there's a complaint about, poor communication, or there's inconsistency in terms of, billing for rentals or something like that. All of these things are because there's no policy. And if you have a policy on conflict of interest, you know exactly what it is, exactly what you're going to do about it when it shows up, all this kind of stuff. So you don't have to reinvent it every time. So that's the key thing. It's just it takes a big load off the board having to kind of figure out everything from scratch every time a new issue comes up. It also frees up for the staff, like the executive director. It means that they have a piece of paper, they have a policy that they can go to if there's some new situation that's come up, and they can look at it and say, does this apply? If so, then I'm just going to follow it, and they don't have to get in touch with the board to say, what the heck are we going to do about this?
And how about you, Rob, from your perspective?
Well, everything that Mark said, I'd also add transparency. I think that's the key to policy, is if you've got good policy and it's published policy that is available to your constituents, then there's a high level of transparency there. And policy are guidelines, and what Mark said, it removes a lot of the questions once you establish good policy. Interpretation is always interesting. Everybody interprets things differently. So your policy has to be as clear and really as simple as possible. Trying to make it complicated and be all things for everyone is really difficult. So the simpler the policy, the better. But again, I think transparency really is the key.
Such a great point, hey? Like the idea around transparency. So tell me this. When you think about the sort of that evolution of an organization, so Mark, what you had talked about is the first step is really having those good bylaws in place. If we have listeners here who are listening and thinking, oh, I have nothing, our organization has no policies in place, what is your advice for where they would get started?
Well, there are a couple of things. One is to kind of figure out which are the things that are going to bite you. Like, what are the things that are out there that are going to get you in trouble? A real classic one is conflict of interest. It's so easy. It's so easy to find a template conflict of interest policy online someplace. They're all over the place, they're typically very short. Like I think the one that we're using is maybe 3 paragraphs. Like it doesn't really have to be much, but you just sort of decide what it is and you put it in place and you stick it in the binder and it's available, or you can even put it on your website. So it's available for everybody and it's sort of done. And you sort of say, well, that was easy. So what's the next thing that's likely to cause us some trouble? The one that's obviously top of mind for most people these days is workplace violence and harassment. And it's getting to the point now that if you don't have a harassment policy, increasingly funders are not going to fund you because they don't have that faith that your organization is capable of or what's the word, trustworthy, really. Mm-hmm. Can be trusted to conduct a project in keeping with their values. So I think what I would suggest for boards trying to figure out what to do is sort of like what are the most urgent things and what are the things that can wait. And because you don't have to do them all at once. It doesn't mean you have to have a kind of policy binder from day one. You can gradually just kind of create policies. And oftentimes what will happen is you'll run into a problem. You'll run into a conflict of interest situation or something like that. And then you sort of say, you solve it. The board gets together and solves it and says, well, wait a second, we should really do a policy on this so we don't have to solve it again next time it comes up. Yeah.
Such a great point. So, Rob, from your perspective, when we think about Music PEI, you were part of the founding of that organization in 2008. Thinking now, a decade and a bit on, what was that evolution like for your organization, and at what point did you start thinking about policy? Were there particular ones that you felt it was important based on your organization or your membership to get started with first?
Well, when we were established, we had a very forward-thinking board, and one of the very first things they wanted to do was to establish some policies. And my advice to organizations that are just starting out, the easiest way to do that is to go to other like-minded or similar organizations, organizations with good track records that have been around for a while, and use them as a template. You don't need to start from scratch. You don't need to create the wheel all over again. Many organizations have done these things, and there's usually organizations out there that are quite similar to what you do. In our case, it was the other music industry associations across the country that some of them had been around for 10 or 15 years at that point. And so we just went to them. That made it really easy, and then we just had to modify it for our own uses. But that's really the easiest way to get your initial policies established, and then as you go, you'll find that they do need to be tweaked. Times change, for one thing, and just you start to learn more about where the important policies are that you really need to tweak.
Such a good point. And we'll circle back to that. But Mark, I wanted to hear a little bit from you. CreativePEI actually has developed some templates that people can use in their organization. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Well, we've identified some templates. Like
okay.
There's we've helped set up a couple of new organizations, and in terms of like even bylaws, oftentimes the best way to start with bylaws is if you're setting up a new organization is to find one that's kind of doing the same thing and use theirs. And so for Art in the Open, for instance, VideogamesPEI, we set up new bylaws from scratch with both of those organizations. But in actual fact, what we did is we found similar organizations in other provinces and then kind of adapted them. So we've kind of we seem to be able to find applicable policies. And then there's one in particular, like Rob mentioned, that there's a process going on in the music industry to come up with sort of a harassment policy that everybody can use. And there have been similar things like this that have happened, like the theater industry worked on one last year. It's really good. And then there's this other one that we're kind of involved in with the Cultural Human Resources Council in Ottawa. They're the national equivalent to us. And they worked with a bunch of different organizations to come up with this sort of broad-based general workplace violence and harassment policy for all sorts of different kinds of arts organizations. So we've got that right now available as a Google Doc, and it can just be kind of adapted. So what we've been doing is starting to reach out to some of the organizations here in PEI to sit down with them and say, what do you think of this policy? If you can use it, can we kind of edit it to make it work for you? So that's the current one. That's the one that I'm really kind of hoping that more people will pick up on it, because it's fairly involved. I think if you tried to do a harassment policy from scratch yourself, you could waste a heck of a lot of time trying to figure out what all should be in it. Sure. Even simple things like what the definition is of harassment. But in terms of things like one of the things that I really like about the policy that the Cultural Human Resources Council came up with is that it's got a bunch of really practical stuff in it. It's sort of like, you have to actually name the person or the position that is the first person who gets reported to, and if that's the person who's actually the subject of the complaint, who's the person you go to instead, and then who does that person tell, and so kind of having it really, really practical, so that if a complaint comes in, you know exactly who's got to deal with it. It's written right there, who's got to deal with it, and what happens under all these various different circumstances that you can imagine. So that's one of the things I really like about that particular policy.
That's great, thank you. And Rob, you're working on one too with a national perspective?
It is. It's the Canadian Music Industry associations. There's a lot of different, I think there's over 24 industry associations. Some of them are provincial, some national. And some of the highlights, it's developing best practice policies, setting standards that will protect people in the industry, recognition that there must be zero tolerance for harassment, and then seeking ways to provide resources for victims and what steps to do when harassment occurs. So it's really important stuff. It's still in the process, so
Sure.
There's a lot of work to be done on it yet.
So, one of the things that you said earlier around policy is that when times change, we have to look at our, the changing policies. So tell me a little bit about, what is the impetus for looking at things like harassment or some of these more cutting edge policies that maybe weren't a consideration 5 or 10 years ago?
Well, as everyone should be aware, things have changed. The Me Too movement is a great example of that, and really puts an exclamation mark on it. The music industry has a pretty poor history and track record. Gender equality was not a priority in any way, shape, or form. And in fact, it was the opposite,
Sure.
Pretty much. Women were almost always paid less than men and got, lower quality opportunities, those kinds of things. And then, of course, sexual harassment was pretty rampant too. So it's really important for our industry to accept that those issues were there and need to be dealt with. And policy like this, hopefully, will be part of the change.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I see the value around policy, in particular, if we're thinking about something like, a move toward gender equality, is when we look at things like policy, that's one part of changing the environment. And so we sometimes tend to think when change needs to happen, it has to happen at a personal level. And that, though, for in this particular example, if you want to be a woman in the music industry, historically, it would be go and be one of the guys, or this is just what the environment looks like. And if you don't want to if you don't want to have that experience, then toddle on off. And so this is really speaking to actually part of what needs to change is the environment. And it is no longer okay for sexual harassment to be rampant. It is no longer okay for women to not have the same bill or the same opportunity same opportunity for gigs as men. And policy is one part of that. So where do you see policy in relation to a changing workplace culture, a changing culture in the creative space, a changing culture in the music industry?
Well, creating and changing policy is one thing. Enforcing it is another. Living it daily through, an organization's activities or personal activities. That's where, the change really needs to come. But establishing policy at least gives people some guidelines to say, okay, this is okay, this is not okay. And hopefully, if that is promoted enough, really, that's the key is to promote these types of policies in order for change to happen.
Thanks. Yes.
So yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something that Rob was saying, which is that just having a policy really isn't enough, And I think in the case of harassment, it's really important as we move forward with these things to actually actively educate, to sort of say, this is the policy, this is why we're doing it, let's discuss what the issues are and why we're in this position. Because otherwise it can just be sort of a document that sits there. Or you could even worse, you could have something, a template document, some board says, oh yeah, it sounds good, they pass it and never look at it again. So there is this business of bringing policy into action that's really, really important. The other thing is that it's an interesting process that I think is possible. It's something we've been talking about at FilmPEI, which is the idea of, okay, so let's say FilmPEI as an organization says it's going to abide by this harassment policy. So what about requiring people who rent equipment from FilmPEI to also abide by this same harassment policy? In which case you're kind of pushing it out into the world a little bit. And I like that idea. We haven't actually come around to that point yet, but I think it's a very interesting model that you can use. I think it's one of the reasons why a lot of funders are kind of getting behind harassment policies, because they're kind of pushing it out into the world and making sure that the people that they partner with are considering these sorts of issues.
And I think what you're talking about there, Mark, that I think is really quite remarkable is this idea that we all have power. And we can all use that power or that authority in a way that is going to change the environment or the situation for everyone. So, funders, their power is in their willingness to fund you, and they have the ability to tie certain requirements to the funding. As FilmPEI, what you're exploring is really cool around, are there ways that we can use our power as the owner of this equipment to change that environment around us? It's a really interesting idea.
Well, there's also kind of a liability question. The thing is, if you actually support a production and there's some big harassment issue that comes up in that production, that reflects really, really badly on you, So, and the question is, in fact, the question is really, what's your liability in that case? How responsible are you for the actions of organizations that you actively support? So, I think there's some. It's using power, but it's also acknowledging responsibility.
Yeah, very good point. So, I would love to hear a little bit about how you keep your policies up to date. So how often do you do a policy review when you bump up against a policy that you've created that no longer works for your organization? Do you have a sort of a regular cadence to reviewing your policy?
Not often enough. It's, those are the kinds of things. I mean, who wants to spend hours and hours reviewing policy? It's not a lot of fun. You do it when you need to. Obviously, when you're presented with a situation that's not covered or you haven't come across before, then the onus is on the organization to deal with it then. Right now, we are currently going through policy and procedure review. First time in 10 years, that's
Okay.
a long time. I would suggest that, it should probably be reviewed at least every 5 years. And the same for bylaws too, really. But it does, policies, harassment policies, those kinds of things, puts a lot of onus on an organization. And it's not easy to, police those kind of things. Sometimes if you're faced with a situation, your policy could be very black and white. Situations rarely are.
So true.
And that can be a real challenge for organizations, for sure. As much as you want to make the right decisions, it's not always easy.
And how do you manage that tension?
When it comes down to something like that, where it's not really clear cut, it usually ends up going to the board. Because the board is ultimately responsible for governance of the organization. At least it should go to the board. I think that's important. And, to have group input, having a diverse board is key, really, really key. Equality in gender, age, race, as much as you can. So that there's equal voices on decisions like that.
Sure. And Mark?
Well, I just wanted to pick up on that idea of the board's role in all this. I mean, ultimately, if you have no policies, then the board is deciding everything. And so that's always the fallback. Is if you have some place where there's an absence of policy or where the policy clearly isn't going to work, then it just goes back to the board and suddenly it becomes their work again. And it kind of reminds them of why they should have had a better policy in place.
I was just going to say, that's not a preferred situation.
No. But the thing is, in that sort of situation, if there is no policy, I've been in these situations where the executive director is just sending out notes to the board all the time saying, I had this request from so-and-so, can I say yes to it? And it's sort of like, gosh, really? Do we have to deal with stuff on that level of detail? Let's put a policy in right away.
Sure. So, I mean, that's the reality of policy, right? So on the one hand, it can be boring and a bit of a challenge to put in place. And in that big picture, it actually, the little bit of pain that we go through in order to set them up, it actually is very freeing for both our executive director or the management of the organization and the board.
Yeah, you got to keep in mind there's two different types of boards. There's operational boards and governance boards. An operational board is one that is generally volunteer. They don't have full-time staff. They pretty much do everything themselves. A governance board is one that, there's a full-time staff, generally an executive director or CEO of some kind. So an operational board is going to have to deal with that
absolutely
every day. That's just their job, and they've agreed to take that role on. Governance board, once the policies are in place, really it's their job just to make sure that the policies are being adhered to. And that's, the responsibility of the executive director or the leader of the organization to keep the board informed.
Yeah, there's another thing I want to mention in terms of the board's role in this and in terms of managing the workload, which is the idea of some kind of committee, like a policy committee of some sort. And in several organizations I'm involved in now, that's the kind of what they've come around to, the idea of trying to do policies with the whole board, like develop policies involving the whole board, is just too much work, and if you get 2 or 3 people who actually like this kind of thing and are willing to take it on and to put forward pretty much fully cooked policy to the board and have them approve it is just a way more efficient way of doing it. And if you have a policy committee, then what you can do is you can have them just review things on a cycle, and without having to involve the whole board.
Sure. So I think not to freak people out by the idea of policy, particularly if we're at a place in an organization where, they may not have any at all. What proportion of your job is this? Is this something that you do a lot of, or is this something that it's important to do that kind of hard work at the beginning and then it's done and you don't have to think about it quite as often?
That's certainly the goal, Mark?
Yeah.
Is get it done as soon as you can, because it does really, it's liberating.
It's great.
There's
also a kind of a difference in terms of the types of organization. Like our organization doesn't have as much need for really involved policies as an organization like FilmPEI, which is doing equipment rentals and dealing with the public, running workshops. There's a whole bunch of things that are going on there that all require policy in order to be able to set it up. What are the rental rates? Who qualifies for discounts? What's the penalty if you return the thing late? And all this stuff has to be covered in some kind of policy. So their need for policy is much, much greater than an organization like ours, which really is more of a kind of a consulting organization, and doesn't have a lot of sort of detailed operational things that need to be covered by policy.
Okay. So yeah, really, there's lots of things to consider then. There's the size of your organization, what your organization does, and then some of those, like what would be most important. There's kind of like the key ones, and we know that harassment and workplace violence are important ones. You had talked about conflict of interest. Just to wrap up, is there any sort of final piece of advice that you would give to organizations who are beginning down this path of creating and developing good, solid policy?
Like I said earlier on, transparency is key. I think that if you are able to develop good policies and they're available for people to see on the website, just a quick example is our funding program. We've got a paper on our website that says how the decisions are made. It's really clear. This is the policy. This is how it's done. If you don't agree with it, well, you can lodge a complaint, but it's a very fair policy. But it's all transparent. It's easy to see. There should be no question. So I think that's really key. And like I said earlier, using another organization as an example. And really, when it gets down to it, policy is about being fair in all aspects of what you're doing, and just integrity.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, the main thing I would kind of underline at the end here is this idea that developing policy sounds like a real chore. And in some ways it is, but it's an interesting chore because it actually forces you to think things through and figure out what you actually believe. Like if you're running a grant program or something like that, you need to figure out, who's it for? How do we decide how do we know what we're trying to accomplish with it? How do we know if something succeeded? How are we going to decide who gets it and who doesn't? All these are really important questions that need to be sorted out. And if you don't do the work of sitting down and saying, well, what is this program really about? Or what do we really care about in terms of harassment? Then you're kind of floating through your job as a board member without actually doing the work, which is to provide the vision for the organization and articulate that and get it down on paper. So I would suggest that really as kind of onerous as it sounds, it's really important work, and kind of the earlier you get at it, the better.
Wonderful. I love those pieces of advice to end on. And Rob and Mark, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thanks. Been a pleasure.
Thanks.